Okay, so I have titled this presentation rather aptly, I would say, Disorganized Crime, because it is going to be a mess. Not because I don't have enough information, but because I have too much. So we're just gonna get in there. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about what I'm going to try to cover here. First of all, the question I'm going to be attempting to answer is, how effective was the Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act of 1970, heretofore referred to as RICO, because I don't want to say that whole thing every single time. How effective was that at curbing organized crime in America? We're going to find out. So I want to talk about, just briefly, organized crime before Prohibition, crime syndicates pre-RICO, RICO, crime syndicates post-RICO, and then, again, like 10 years later, and then organized crime as it exists now, which isn't really part of the project, but I want to talk about it anyway. So, okay, so prior to Prohibition, there wasn't really organized crime in America, which is, what a world to live in, right? You had crime still, but it was state or local level crime and handled by the state or local police. And you still had gangs, sure, okay, maybe some violence here and there, but for the most part, they kept their territories, okay? And occasionally, you maybe have a little bit of trouble here and there, but you didn't have interstate crime really. You had labor racketeering, but not nearly to the extent that you have it later. So, but that's prior to Prohibition, back when we had some sense. But then Prohibition happens. Ha, ha. It just triggers this spread of organized crime, kind of a domino effect. Because see, the thing about this is that they ban the distribution of liquor, right? Well, see, when you do that, you create a black market for it. So now liquor is a hot commodity, and gangs are like, you know how much money we could make off of this because we're criminals and we do crime? So they start distributing liquor across state lines, and they a lot of times will use waterways to transport it. So then liquor bootlegging becomes super lucrative. And because of this, gangs started to have turf wars over who was able to distribute liquor where. And that caused an uptick in violent crimes. So now not only do you have bootlegging, but you have violence to a greater degree than you did before, which is so great. But hey, Prohibition will make us a moral society, right? Okay, yeah, that's it for this slide. So then they repealed Prohibition. It did nothing, as you can see by my Full House style postcard that I have here. All better, right? No, wrong. Now we're in the middle of a depression, and organized crime be booming. Honest work is very hard to come by, so a lot of people turn to crime, like bootlegging and drug trafficking, because there's money in it, right? And those who want to start legitimate businesses don't have the cash to do it because, we're in a cash-starved economy. We live in a society. But who has cash? Oh, I don't know. Maybe the gangs who have been bootlegging liquor for the last decade. So who do you think that these businessmen are going to go to for loans? I don't know. Maybe the gangs who have been bootlegging liquor for the last decade. So repealing Prohibition did nothing. So where are the police during all this? What are they doing? Well, see, the thing about that is that a lot of the state and local police were in the pockets of these gangsters. They were paid off, also politicians, but that's nothing new, right? Nothing has changed. Therefore, they're not really much help. And even the state and local police that are not paid off don't have near enough men or resources to sufficiently fight interstate crime. Because that's what it was interstate crime. So who would fight, crime that falls under federal jurisdiction? Oh, the federal government, maybe. The Bureau, maybe. But see, the thing about that is they couldn't prove that it was interstate crime. So the federal government didn't really have any jurisdiction either. So it's like they were playing freaking monkey in the middle with, whose responsibility it was. And it just didn't get handled. But see, it sort of did, though. Because then, they got Al Capone. Oh, this is a big deal. Capone's been arrested. He's like the big man on campus. He's the kingpin. They got him for tax evasion, of all things. And then he died of syphilis like several years later, but that's irrelevant. Is that thunder? I'm sorry. Anyway, so you think, oh boy, they got Capone. Now all of his men are going to just scatter like a thing that scatters, right? You would think, as you can see by my lovely meme that I have here. I've worked very hard on that. You would think. But you'd be wrong. Because, see, the thing about that is that even though Capone's been arrested, everything is somehow worse because somehow his Chicago outfit actually got stronger after he was arrested. And at the same time, Lucky Luciano, who's this infamous gangster, formed the Commission, which was made up primarily of the five families. They have gone by different names over the years, but I believe now they're known as the Gambino family, Lucchese family, the Genovese family, the Bonanno family, and the Colombo families. Not that it matters. And also the bosses of the Chicago outfit, and also the bosses of the Buffalo crime family. So all the bad guys are on the same page now, which is just so great. Teamwork. So now they're mediating their own disputes. There's not really turf wars anymore. They're just committing crimes in harmony, which is great. And also that same year, Public Enemy and Little Caesar were released in theaters. And so it kind of glorified the life of a gangster, which also isn't great. When gangsters are bad. And also, the police are still busy because now they're fighting Nazis. I went a little bit out of order with Prohibition and Al Capone, but it's fine. We're going to move past it. So when you get to, like, you know, World War II, that's kind of a big deal. This is a couple years down the line. But they had pro-Nazi / communist / fascist groups that were popping up in America. And they were like, we don't like that. So they were kind of focused on that, which, like, you know, fair enough. I can't really blame them. Like, maybe take care of that first. But it meant that they shifted their focus away from organized crime, which also wasn't good. So I like this scene from Goodfellas. So when he's like, "What do you want to tell me now, tough guy? I'm in the middle of the weeds, laying down," you know. As it turns out, it doesn't matter what he tells them because they can't arrest him anyway because the legislation that they have, the standards of evidence are often too high. The standards of proof are often too high. And like I said, a lot of times they couldn't prove that the crimes that were occurring were interstate, or it was very, very difficult for them to do so. So organized crime really hit its stride in the 50s, specifically La Cosa Nostra, the five families. So there were still arrests, but there weren't a whole lot of convictions. As an example, there was police captain William Drury, who was murdered in Chicago. And these two pretty big Chicago gangsters were suspected of killing him. They had a decent amount of evidence. They were held for questioning, but they were never convicted because the evidence wasn't sufficient. So, you know, gee golly, that's kind of a problem. So they were like, wait a minute, okay, maybe we should address this in like the 60s. Because the government was like, oh, organized crime is kind of interfering with economic process. And this guy, Joseph Valachi, publicly disclosed the existence of the five families. So now the federal government can't really ignore it. So in 68, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, whereas I'm affectionately referring it to as the RTS Bus Act, that was passed, and it basically made it easier for agents to get the go-ahead on wiretapping. But if these gangsters were speaking in code over the phone or in their homes or whatever when they're talking about this stuff, that doesn't help them because you can catch them talking about trading golf clubs for shampoo, but that's not really illegal. So even if you know, I don't think this guy's trading golf clubs for shampoo, I think there's some drugs in there somewhere, it doesn't matter what you think because you can't prove it. So it helped, but like not much. But you know what did help? RICO. So this is just, you can just ignore that. So the Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act made organized crime membership a punishable offense, which shockingly it wasn't before. Crazy, right? You'd think they would have addressed this before 1970. It increased fines that were associated with these convictions. It lengthened the sentences, and it made it easier to grant federal jurisdiction over these cases. It lowered the standard of proof, and it relaxed the rules of evidence. It also made it easier to apply civil sanctions to racketeers, which labor racketeering then, you know, supposedly, oh great, now we can take care of labor racketeering because RICO's going to make it easier for us, yay. So initially, I was like, RICO didn't even work because it was passed in 1970, and then over the next 10 years, organized crime skyrocketed. It actually got worse, so it didn't work. So you had labor racketeering was still a big thing. Game fixing all throughout the 70s, like for NBA games and things like that. The Lufthansa heist in 1978, which was the largest cash robbery on American soil at the time, and which was orchestrated and carried out by the Lucchese crime family. And just under the noses of these government officials, which just gives me so much faith in our law enforcement system. Anyway, as an example, Henry Hill, he's quite an iconic gangster. He was arrested in 1972 for extortion, and that was in Tampa. put us on the map. He only served 4 years of his 10-year sentence, and then he was released because Paul Vario, who was his boss on the outside, was able to get him a job. It was a no-show job, and he just went back to selling drugs. So it didn't really do anything to actually stop the crime that was happening. Even with wiretaps, Henry Hill and his associates were smart enough to use coded language, so they couldn't convict him for the drug stuff because they were using coded language. He was also part of a point shaving scheme in 1978 to 79 involving Boston College. And the drug trafficking was a really big thing for him. Marijuana and coke and quaaludes and heroin. So he was in a lot. He had his hand in every single pot. And the federal government's just like, whew, you know. Finally, though, in 1980, somebody got smart and was like, hey, let's convict this guy using RICO. So in 1980, he's arrested, and he ends up turning informant in exchange for witness protection because he is afraid that he's going to die. Because, you know, his buddies were not real happy with him for getting caught. Anyway, so his testimony ended up leading to 50 convictions. So then I was like, wait a minute. Maybe RICO worked. Maybe I was a little too quick to make an assumption here. And I was in fact too quick to make an assumption. So I will admit when I'm wrong. RICO did finally work. It took a decade, but it did finally work. In 1981, the first Cosa Nostra boss RICO conviction happened. It was Frank Thierry, who was the boss of the Genovese crime family. And then from there, it was just like a freaking floodgate was opened. All through the 80s, there were tons of convictions for labor racketeering. These unions were disrupted by the civil aspect of RICO, and hundreds of Cosa Nostra members were convicted. And the Cosa Nostra was the main focus of RICO. That was kind of the main concern at the time. I mean, you had like the Chicago outfit and stuff, but La Cosa Nostra was like, that was big. So the fact that they were taking down hundreds of these members of these families was insane. RICO also let the Federal Bureau of Investigation bring organized crime unions under the remedial authority of the federal courts. You had big names like John Gotti and his son and his brother, all of them convicted on RICO-based charges. Insane, right? So RICO definitely worked. But see, there's one thing about that doesn't really make sense. Why did it take so long? Number one, how dare you? Number two, why did it take so long? Okay, well, the thing about that is that RICO was pretty complex, and it was relatively new as far as like the type of legislation that it was. There wasn't really anything like it at the time. I don't know if there is anything like it still. It's very unique. So federal prosecutors didn't really use RICO extensively at first because they didn't really think about it. They were so used to using conspiracy and other charges, usually unsuccessfully, that they didn't bother being like, maybe we should use this new law that was written specifically so we could arrest these guys. So it took them a decade, but finally federal prosecutors started using it, and ever since 1980, practically every significant organized crime prosecution has included a RICO count. The pattern of racketeering section of RICO has been particularly useful, and defendants usually cooperate because they don't want to have to get smacked with that life sentence that RICO bestows upon them. So, you know, it's really just a beautiful operation now that they're actually using the law. So yeah, I guess it worked. Organized crime still exists, but it's changed super drastically. La Cosa Nostra lost a ton of their influence and power because of RICO, and most organized crime groups now are different kinds of gangs. It's a whole different beast. Not just interstate gangs, but international. So that's a completely different thing. So as it pertains to this particular project, yes, RICO was effective at curbing organized crime. It just took longer than I initially thought. So yeah. This is irrelevant to the question that I was asking, but you can just consider it bonus content because I want to talk about it. So I'm kind of interested in how legislation now maybe is going to change. Maybe it won't, but ever since the 90s, there have been, not as much right now, but in the 90s, there were Russian-American gangs that were more into money laundering and prostitution than anything else. In the early 2000s, there was a particularly interesting event that occurred that kind of caused the federal government to be like, we're going to not focus on organized crime right now because we have this other thing going on over here and there's a plane in that building and it shouldn't be there. So you know what? Valid. Focus on that, right? But now in recent years, one gang that has popped up that's caused quite a few problems here is MS-13, and that's an international thing, and their main thing is human trafficking, as far as I am aware, as far as I understand. So that's a big deal. But looking at RICO, I don't know if it really can sufficiently cover situations like that, because it's not what it was written for. It was written more for gangs like La Cosa Nostra. So I'm just curious to see if maybe they'll have to change legislation at all, or write new legislation to kind of deal with these gangs that are cropping up now, or if they'll deal with them at all. Who knows? Who knows? Maybe there's too much else going on in the world that they're not going to focus on that anymore. But yeah, I apologize. This is sort of all over the place. Also, the slides were kind of low quality, but I had so much information and I didn't want to type it all out on the slide because then it would just get boring to read. So yeah, forget about it or something.